Okay, we'll get started. And I'm very, very happy to introduce our esteemed panel for the next session on questions, humility, and the open mind. So we're going to be hearing from Heather Battaly, Professor of Philosophy here at the University of Connecticut, on the puzzle of humility and disparity. And then we'll be hearing from Walter Sinnott-Armstrong, the Chauncey Stillman Professor of Practical Ethics at Duke University, and two of his postdoctoral researchers, who unfortunately I don't have the names written down here, but I'm sure they can introduce themselves. Questions of polarization. And the third talk by Teresa, who's a PhD candidate here in philosophy on the moral and social origins of epistemic normativity.
So thanks, everybody. I want to especially thank Michael Lynch and the Humility and Conviction in Public Life Project. What I'm going to present today is actually part of a co-authored work. I am one of 4 co-authors on this. The other authors are Dennis Whitcomb, Jason Baer, and Dan Howard Snyder. And I should mention that this work is actually part of a different JTF grant, so it's part of a grant on developing humility and leadership. Does everybody have a handout? Perfect. Okay. I'm going to start with a quote from Frederick Douglass, okay, which is not on your handout. So humility seems uncalled for when you're oppressed. So Frederick Douglass says this. He says, quote, "With a book in my hand so redolent of the principles of liberty, and with the perception of my own human nature and of the facts of my past and present experience, I was equal to a contest with the religious advocates of slavery, whether white or black. For blindness in this matter was not confined to the white people. I've met at the South many good, religious, colored people who were under the delusion that God required them to submit to slavery and to wear their chains with meekness and humility. I could entertain no such nonsense as this." Okay. So humility seems the last thing an enslaved person needs, right? More generally, and to put it mildly, humility seems to be an inappropriate response for the oppressed toward oppressors. It seems inappropriate in other contexts as well. So if you find yourself accosted by a neo-Nazi, humility seems like the wrong response. Just as it does when you're evangelized by a flat earther, right? So Philip earlier mentioned going to a conference of flat earthers. So humility seems inappropriate as a response in a variety of contexts, but how is this possible, right? Humility is supposed to be a virtue, and virtues are supposed to be appropriate across contexts, okay? So this is the puzzle of humility that's on the top of your handout, okay? What we argue in this paper is that humility is limited in several different ways. Nevertheless, even though it's limited, we think that humility is still a virtue in what we're calling contexts of disparity. We take context of oppression to be one kind of context of disparity. Interacting with a neo-Nazi, interacting with a flat earther are sort of standard cases, okay? So I want to say a little bit about the ways in which we think humility is limited. I'm going to run through 4 of these, and then I'll talk a little bit about the ways in which we've been thinking that humility is still appropriate in context of disparity. Okay, so first reason for thinking that the importance of humility is limited in these cases. It's more important for oppressors, for neo-Nazis and flat earthers, to be humble than it is for people who are oppressed, or those of us who are interacting with the neo-Nazis or the flat earthers, okay? So it's more important for the people who are doing the oppressing, the people who are in the wrong, to be humble than it is for the people who are in the right. A second reason we think that the importance of humility is limited is we think it's more important for folks who are in the right side of contexts of disparity, so folks who are being oppressed, folks who happen to find themselves in an interaction with a neo-Nazi, folks who believe that the earth is round, right? It's more important for us to draw on other virtues in these contexts, like pride, self-trust, courage, perseverance, than it is for us to draw on humility. So, 2 ways so far in which we think the importance of humility is limited in these contexts. We also acknowledge that structural solutions may be more important in these contexts than developing individual virtues, okay? Or at least structural solutions might be run simultaneously with efforts to develop individual virtues, okay? We've got a 4th reason for arguing that humility is limited, and this requires a little bit of philosophical machinery. So that's what I've laid out on the handout here. Okay, so I'm going to say a little bit about our definition of the trait of humility, and then say a little bit about how we're thinking of humility as a virtue and how it's different from the vice of sterility. We think it's different from arrogance too. So the trait of humility, as the 4 of us have been thinking about it, is it involves being attentive to and owning our limitations. And here, when we're talking about humility in general, we're talking about limitations that aren't just intellectual ones. They might go beyond intellectual limitations. So some examples are moral mistakes. I might be attentive to and own breaking a promise to someone. Affective shortcomings, like not having a sense of humor. Deficits in general skills, like being a bad driver. Or flaws in moral character, like being cowardly or being rash or something like that. Okay, so we've been thinking of being attentive to our limitations as being aware of them, so they pop up on our radar, right? As opposed to being oblivious to them. And we've been thinking of owning as involving a sort of suite of dispositions that are motivational, behavioral, cognitive, and affective. So owning characteristically involves when a sort of limitation pops up on your radar, right? So when I'm aware that I'm a bad driver, right? Owning my limitation of being a bad driver involves accepting that I have the limitation. So when I'm aware of it, I don't deny it, right? I don't deny it to myself. I accept it. I maybe admit it to myself. I might have to admit it to others depending on the context. I care about it. I take it seriously to whatever extent it's worth taking seriously. I could just Uber after all. And I might feel regret or dismay. Okay. So our key idea here is that the trait of humility involves these 2 pieces. Attentiveness by itself isn't enough because we could be attentive to our limitations but hide them or conceal them or get really defensive about them when somebody else points them out. Or we could just be complacent about them. We might not care about them at all or take them seriously. And so owning tries to account for those things. So we've also been thinking of the trait of humility as different from the virtue. So we try to lay out in this paper the idea that somebody could possess the trait but fail to possess the virtue, because possessing the virtue involves being attentive to and owning our limitations for the right reasons, at the right times, and with the right motives. So the idea here is roughly Aristotelian, right? So we're coming out of a Aristotelian virtue ethics tradition here. So in order to have the virtue of humility, as opposed to the trait, we can't go overboard. okay? We can have the trait of being attentive to and owning our limitations, but be humble to a fault. Okay, we can over-own our limitations, as it were. Okay, so an example of an excess of the trait of humility might be deferring to everyone at every opportunity without considering the merit of their views. Okay, so deferring to a neo-Nazi or a flat earther would not be an example of humility. It would not be an example of the virtue of humility. It would be an example of excessive humility as a trait. We call humility to a fault as a trait, or going overboard with respect to the trait of humility, we call that servility, and we think it's a vice. So somebody could be servile, they could over-own limitations by being obsessed with them or caring too much about them or being overwhelmed by them. And we're thinking of humility as lying in a mean between a vice of servility, where one over-owns limitations, and a vice of arrogance where one under-owns them. Okay? So the virtue of humility is a disposition to appropriately be attentive to and own our limitations, and to do so for the right reasons with the right motives, and I haven't said anything about motives here. Okay, so fourth reason that Frederick Douglass is right, that the importance of humility is limited, is that the trait of humility is limited. The trait of humility can be excessive, it can go overboard, we can be humble to our fault, and the trait of humility can misadvise us. Okay? Okay, flip side. Okay, so nevertheless, despite humility being limited in these four ways, what we try to argue in this paper is that there are still several ways in which humility is appropriate when we are oppressed persons interacting with oppressors, or when we are us interacting with neo-Nazis, or when we are us interacting with flat earthers. Okay? And we talk about 5 ways in the paper. Humility, the virtue of humility helps us balance our ambitions. It helps us balance our beliefs. It helps us balance our emotions. It helps us seek and accept assistance when we should. And it helps us stay engaged with other people when some other virtue is on the scene telling us that engagement's appropriate. Okay, so we're not assuming that humility is the virtue that tells us when engagement's appropriate. We think some other virtue will be doing that, like civility or justice or respect or charity. Okay, so we don't think humility is performing that function. Okay, so I'm not going to be able to talk through all this stuff, but I'll just say a little bit about each of these. So with respect to balancing ambition, so humility can help us set goals that aren't too difficult to achieve. Okay, so if Philip, when he goes to the Flat Earther conference, thinks, oh, I'm going to convince all these people they're wrong, and I'm going to do it by 5 p.m. today. Okay, so if he does that, right, that might be, even for Philip, that might be too difficult a goal to achieve. Okay, so if Philip thinks he can achieve that goal, he may be under-owning his limitations, right? Even he has some limits, okay? So, right, humility can help there. Humility can prevent us from overlooking that limitation, right? And it can prevent us from setting goals that are too ambitious, right? But at the same time, it can prevent us from setting goals that are too easy, right? So somebody who is servile, who over-owns their limitations, right, may be so focused on their own shortcomings and their own cognitive flaws that they don't think they're going to be able to knock a chip out of the flat earthers' argument at all. They don't think they're ever going to be able to make progress with the flat earth. Right? That's servility, not humility. And we think humility can prevent us from thinking we aren't capable of making any progress. So humility can help us balance our ambitions and goals when we're interacting with a flat earther, say. Okay? It can also help us balance our beliefs. So it can help us avoid forming beliefs that outstrip our evidence. So I may, if I'm in an interaction with a white supremacist, I may have the tendency to jump to the conclusion that the white supremacist is not human, but an irredeemable monster. Okay? And humility, right? That's a limitation. That belief outstrips my evidence, right? I probably have some evidence for thinking that the white supremacist is vicious in some domains of their life. I don't have evidence for thinking that they're inhuman or that they're a monster, okay? So humility can help me recognize that that tendency to jump to that conclusion is a limitation of mine, and it can help prevent me from jumping to that conclusion, okay? But at the same time, right, it can help us bolster our beliefs where that is what's needed, okay? It can prevent us from overwhelming limitations here. So if instead of having the tendency to jump to the conclusion that the white supremacist is an irredeemable monster, I am so focused on my own flaws and limitations that I'm inclined to think that the white supremacist isn't making any mistakes, and I don't trust myself, right? Then the virtue of humility can help me rein in my overowning of my limitations, right? And help me come to believe that the white supremacist is making mistakes, or at least get me closer to that. Okay. Humility can also help us balance our emotions. This is a really tricky area. But suppose when we go to a flat earther conference, our affective response to the flat earthers is, I don't know, white hot rage and revulsion or something, right? So we're not just sort of, I don't know, mildly annoyed or bemused or dismayed or what have you. We are crazy angry, okay? In a case like that, right, humility can prevent me from responding to the flat earther with this kind of white hot rage, right? If I'm arrogant, I might underown that as a limitation. I might fail to recognize that that's my response and that that's an inappropriate response. If I'm humble, that can help me rein that limitation in, okay? But on the other hand, right, it can also help us bolster deficient emotions. So, yeah, we may have become sort of affectively numbed to the Klan over the years. And so I may not have the appropriate degree of anger with respect to Klan members, say. So humility in this case can prevent us from being servile, right? It can help us respond to Klan members with anger. Am I out of time?
No, you've got about a minute.
I got a minute. Okay. I also think, so we also talk in this paper about how it can help us, humility can help us seek and accept assistance, and it can help us stay engaged when some other virtue is on the scene telling us to be engaged. We distinguish humility from lowliness and submissiveness. If humility were lowliness or submissiveness, it would be inappropriate. We distinguish humility from humiliation and degradation. If it were those things, it would be inappropriate. And we here also argue that humility does not entail deference. Okay? So if it called for deferring to neo-Nazis or flat earthers, it would be inappropriate. It doesn't, so it's not. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so hi, I want to start again, like everybody else, thanking Michael and the whole group and the Templeton Foundation and so on for making our work possible. Our work really is a group, so I want to shout out to Aaron and to Rose, and Gus and Jordy are going to talk later. You'll meet them, but there are a lot of other people back at home. Our group includes faculty and dean and postdocs and grad students and undergrads of various sorts. We've been working on a variety of projects. Political framing is trying to understand how Republicans and Democrats and liberals and conservatives frame issues differently by using different types of language, especially in tweets. That led us to, I'll skip down to the folk conservatism, because that got us interested. What do they really mean by conservatism when they try to say, that word shows that the person's conservative? So we're doing a factor analysis there. Then we've got some interventions where we're trying to understand potential ways to reduce political polarization using methods from the Right Questions Institute, using perspective taking, using something called the Jigsaw Classroom, and we're doing studies about the relationship between humility in particular and polarization. So there's a lot there. No way we can cover it all. Instead, we're going to focus on two projects that in particular illuminate the role of questions in polarization and in reducing polarization. And the reason we do that is because, of course, philosophy began with questions. Now, Socrates went around asking a lot of questions, and that got him a bowl of hemlock. We don't want hemlock, but we do think that asking questions might be an interesting perspective for understanding polarization and also for reducing it potentially. So Gus Skorberg is going to tell us about the first project we're guarding, and then Jordy Carpenter will come in and tell us about the second. Great thing about having people on your project working with you is I only have to talk for 2 minutes.
Fantastic. We'll leave a round of applause while All right, so as Walter mentioned, we have a number of projects on questions, and so one kind of question we were particularly interested in was how questions. And so how questions put us in touch sort of really directly with this literature on the illusion of explanatory depth that Phil sort of introduced this morning and that we heard a lot about last year from Frank Kyle and Steve Sloman and others, and it's probably relatively familiar to this audience at this point, so I won't dwell too long. But the basic idea is that people have this really inflated sense of how everyday objects work, like zippers or toilets or toaster ovens. And one of the headline findings from this research program is that asking people to generate these step-by-step causal explanations can have this effect of sort of puncturing their inflated sense of self-understanding and confidence, right? And so we take it this as like quite well established using lots of everyday devices, things that people come across and use oftentimes in their everyday life. Now, in a particularly interesting paper for our group, Phil and Steve and others sort of hypothesized that maybe this same tendency to have an overinflated sense of how everyday devices work might similarly undergird our beliefs about different political issues. Right? After all, issues like cap and trade are extremely complex. People nonetheless have really strongly held views about it. So perhaps something like this illusion of explanatory depth can also explain people's extreme political views. And so if that's right, then you might think that asking people to generate these step-by-step mechanistic causal explanations would be a reliable way to puncture that inflated sense of understanding, to sort of drive down extreme views, and to reduce people's confidence in those views. And so indeed, in this 2013 paper, they find that looking at a range of issues, across all the issues they looked at, in fact, asking people to generate these explanations about complex political issues reliably reduces people's self-reported understanding of the issues, their certainty or their confidence in the issues, and then I think crucially in this paper, leads them to moderate their stance. Right? So you write that generating mechanistic explanations leads people to endorse more moderate positions by forcing them to confront their ignorance. And so as such, something like this explanation generation promises to be an effective debiasing procedure. So we were really eager about this. Project on questions, this kind of how question that sort of generates or elicits explanation was something that we were really excited about. So what I want to describe today is 4 studies really quickly where we attempted to sort of replicate and extend this line of work. So we use a kind of very standard, similar paradigm for the literature. We gathered people's time 1 ratings of different political issues. We asked them to generate these explanations, and then at time 2, we asked them to sort of re-rate their stance, confidence, and understanding on these issues. So all the studies that we've run, pre-registered on OSF, so all the materials, design, analysis plan, data, scripts are all available there. By now we've collected a little over 1,500 participants across, I guess, 1 pilot study and then 4 of the pre-registered studies I'll discuss today. And we've looked at a variety of issues. And so today I'll only be talking about the issues in bold, the 4 here. So abolishing the Electoral College, allowing automated vehicles, limiting private funding of elections, and then cap and trade for carbon emissions. So these are the 4 that we'll talk about. So the key DVs that we use in this study, kind of very standard for the literature. We ask people how well they understand the issue, how confident they are in their stance, and what their stance on the issue is. And so across all the studies, these are the sort of results that I'll report from these variables. So the very first study that we ran, we sort of surprisingly found that on 3 of the 4 issues, we actually didn't get this predicted decrease. Right? In fact, on one of the issues, people reported understanding the issue better after generating explanations. Right? We found no decrease in confidence for 3 of the 4 issues. Right? And perhaps most importantly, no decrease in stance extremity. Right? So after generating explanations, people sort of either didn't move, or in some cases, they became even more extreme. Right? So what you see on an MTRIC sample, for example, is people start very much in favor of cap and trade policies. They generate explanations, and then at least in this study, they came out even more in favor of the policies than when they started. Right? So sort of following the analysis in the 2013 paper, when we collapse across all 4 issues, we actually find a small but nonetheless significant increase from time 1 to time 2 ratings. Right? So small effect, but nonetheless, we would expect these effects in the opposite direction. We actually find people become more confident in their understanding about these issues. So we sort of thought, okay, what's going on here? We're sort of getting these effects in the opposite direction. And we thought, well, maybe what we needed to do is sort of present people with these really, really detailed expert comparisons. Right? So maybe when people are sort of forced to confront what a really detailed, kind of verbose academic explanation looks like, they would sort of say, oh yeah, well, like by contrast, my explanation is really crappy, and therefore I should, revise my beliefs accordingly. But in fact, what we found in the second study is, again, no decrease in understanding, and in 2 of the issues, again, an increase in understanding. Right? We found no decrease in confidence for 3 of the 4 issues, and replicating the effects from our first study, right, people increased their confidence with the issue of cap and trade, and no decrease in stance extremity for 3 of the 4, and again, for cap and trade, people end up becoming more extreme. And so we sort of felt like, what's going on here? And so we again find that when we collapse across issues, we find a little bit bigger of effect in this particular study, but we still see this increased understanding from time 1 to time 2. And we thought, okay, well, what can we do? So we sort of tried a number of steps to kind of magnify this effect and really sort of figure out like why it wasn't working. So in our third study, we kind of hypothesized that maybe people were anchoring on their time 1 ratings. Right? So they just sort of ask them, what's your stance on this issue? And then they take, a minute or 2 minutes to generate an explanation, and then you're asking them right away the same kind of questions about their stance or their understanding. We thought, oh, maybe what's going on is people are just kind of anchoring on that time 1 rating. So what we did is sort of introduce the distractor almost. So we asked people to provide these ratings for issues that they didn't then go on to explain. So hopefully we'd sort of reduce some of these anchoring effects. And we found that this sort of led to mixed results. So for some issues, we did find this predicted decrease, but for some, we found opposite effects once again. Right? So same with confidence. We don't find this decrease for 2 of the 4 issues. We do get it for election funding, for example. But once again, this cap and trade issue, people report being even more confident. Right? And I think the most striking result, again, across these studies, is that we don't get people's stance to move at all. Right? If anything, generating these mechanistic explanations leads them to become more extreme. Right? So the kind of opposite of the effects that we would have predicted. So after running 3 of these studies, we then sort of said, okay, well, like, let's sort of turn back to the literature. And so in fact, we, drawing on the book that Phil mentioned earlier, the Knowledge Illusion, and then a recent paper by Frank Kyle and some of his grad students, thought, well, maybe because of this phenomenon of the distribution of cognitive labor, maybe what's going on is that people are actually just like Googling these things, right? So when we're sort of qualitatively just looking at some of the explanations people get, they're like, well, that was like really, really good. Like too good for an M-Turker to write in like 2 minutes. And we thought, oh, maybe they're actually just sort of Googling this, right? So maybe the sort of reliable presence of search engines in people's lives now is a sort of thing that actually does lead them to have more confidence in their views, because they can just easily whip out their smartphone and look up, oh wait, what is cap and trade? Right? Or even more so, they can just ask their Alexa to do it while they're sitting there in Enter. Right? So maybe the reliable presence of these search technologies is leading people to sort of undergird their beliefs about various political issues. So what we did is we added a between subjects condition. Right? Everything was exactly the same as the first 3 studies I presented. Here we added a between subjects condition, and we told participants they could feel free to look up information from outside sources like Google or Bing or whatever. And so we actually got about 439 people here, and we did find that 22% of participants did report that they consulted Google or outside sources while they were conducting the study. And so in the results I'll report, these are just going to be showing the people who did report that they Googled outside information, whether or not they were in the condition where we told them to or not. Although interestingly, there were at least some people who we didn't tell to Google that did report that they did. But anyway, so everything we'll show is just about the people who did report. And so what we found with understanding is sort of cool and interesting, but not quite perfect. We still get this time 1 to time 2 increase, right? After generating explanations, people still do say they understand the issues better, but we find a significant interaction such that it's stronger among people who do report Googling, right? So it sort of explains partially why we might see some of those effects, though it doesn't seem to do so cleanly. Right? With respect to confidence, we get a much more clean interaction. Right? So what we see here is that among people that Google, they report significantly higher time to confidence, whereas people who didn't Google remain mostly flat. Right? So we think there's a lot of potential methodological and epistemological implications for this, and we're happy to discuss some of those during the Q&A, but for now I want to turn it over to Jordi, who's going to talk about a sort of different line of research involving different kinds of questions.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to talk about, as Gus said, a totally different kind of research, not just different research question. So what Gus described was it was replication. It was attempting to replicate previous research, very methodologically focused. What I'm going to talk about is something more focused on out in the real world, focused on using kind of out of the lab methods, and much more exploratory. So we're focusing on allowing real people to create the materials that we then end up testing. And again, like the previous study, we're focusing on political discourse. So the kind of reasoning behind this is that discourse, of course, is inherently interpersonal. And we assume that you can have a good or bad intention when you go into discourse, but your good and bad intention doesn't have a direct effect on the person you're talking to. Instead, what you do has the direct effect on the person you're talking to. So if we focus on the words that someone says, then that is going to be the cleanest thing that explains how someone reacts to them. Now we're focusing on questions, our project is on questions, but the reason we thought this was interesting is that questions are very versatile, especially in the context of maybe in political discourse. So questions can be honest requests for information, or they can be attacks. And there's also this whole line of research on civility, and civility is often communicated by use of a question, because questions are less aggressive, again, when they're not phrased as attacks, they are often less aggressive. And we're especially interested in this idea of signaling civility, because how in the real world do you communicate that? How can you look at people's words that they just generate and decide, okay, they mean good things here. They are not being a jerk. And I think this is especially important online, first of all, because more and more political discourse is happening online. And then second, People hate talking about politics online, and they try to avoid it. And I think it's a bit of a missed opportunity. And they try to avoid it, though, for very good reasons. There are, is this going to happen? There are horrible, horrible people online. There's trolls. There's trolls, and there's just a lot of emotions. It's unpleasant. So how do people signal that they are not a troll? We wanted to collect real people's questions online, mimicking an online social media setting as possible, and then use those questions, see how people react to them, to see what people actually responded to as if they were civil. So I use this term good and bad, like what is good and bad in terms of having good and bad effects. This is kind of what I thought good and bad were. You can argue with this. It's just assumed that these things are good and bad. Going to focus mostly on connecting warmth and respect for the other person in the discussion, as well as openness to continuing to talk to them. So again, in stage 1, we asked their people's view on several contentious political issues. We had 6 political issues. They were told to imagine themselves in a conversation with someone who disagrees with them, and then told to write 3 questions that they thought in an online political discourse setting would be useful to ask their conversation partner. Now, useful depended on an assignment that we gave them. We put them into one of 4 conditions, hoping to express a range of different outcomes. And these were the 4 goals. So we assumed, again, based on that list that I showed before, that the first 2 goals that I'm showing there are good. They are part of signaling civility if someone gets the idea that you have these intentions. And the second 2 are bad. They're having antisocial effects. So then in stage 2, after we collected this information, we used it as materials for a new set of participants. Each of these was randomly assigned an issue. They read one of the 3 question sets by a single questioner, and then they were asked to imagine that they saw it in a real internet exchange. Now, importantly, they did not necessarily disagree with the person. That was random. So they assessed the person in various ways, how much they liked and respected and thought the questioner was intelligent, the extent to which they thought they would be open to continuing the conversation. Those 2 things correlated very highly, and they're put together in a positive rating of the questioner. And then finally, very interesting to us, is the forced choice. This idea of which of the 4 goals do you think we gave the person? So we showed them those goals and said, which one do you think they had? And so this is directly getting at, if someone had good intentions, when are people picking up on it? Now, going through these quickly, we had 2 different ways of rating the questions that we came up with. One was specificity, more specific versus more abstract questions. You can see some examples there. Second was something that we called information seeking. And information seeking is the extent to which the person appeared to be genuinely asking for new information. And we had trained raters, they agreed very well, rate each of these 3 question sets. And then finally, we just, pretty dumb question, we looked at how often the question started with what or why, which were the 2 most popular questions. Okay. So the correlations with the assessment of the questioner. Information seeking, so if you thought that the person was seeking new information genuinely, had a positive correlation. Specificity had pretty much a 0 correlation. What questions had a positive association with liking the questioner, and why questions had a pretty strongly negative correlation. Now then, the last thing we'll talk about, how often did people guess these goals? So again, they were shown the 3 questions and then said, which of these goals do you think the person had? Now, surprising to us, people tended to guess the good ones more than the bad ones, particularly the increased understanding. We're not quite sure why that is. It might be the fact that we forced everyone to use questions, and questions might just be a little nicer than other types of discourse. But with that in mind, going to look at what affects the guesses. So looking at information seeking, that's a little small, hopefully people can see. But the take-home message here is, if you write questions that are high in information seeking, people think you have good intentions, and they don't think you have bad intentions. Okay. Now specificity, more specific questions, made people more likely to think you wanted to win the conversation. We left that deliberately open. Participants rated the usefulness of these, and they all hated the win condition. They all thought anyone who's trying to do that is terrible. But the more specific your questions are, the more people thought that, and the less specific they were, the more they thought you were trying to get people to like you. Now remember this, specificity didn't actually have a significant effect. It was pretty much zero with how much people rated actually liking the participant. But they thought it would. And then finally, what and why? The one where I did. Again, what questions had the positive, the good intentions, and negative with the bad, positive with the good intentions, not with the bad intentions. Why questions, pretty much the opposite. And then finally, when you agreed with the participant, you were less likely to think they wanted to win the conversation. You were less likely to think they had this kind of hostile, competitive attitude. Okay, so that's my results. Let's just quickly go to the acknowledgements. So thanks, that's almost our whole team. But thanks to everybody, and thanks to you guys for having us.
So you should have a handout. Let me know and I can give one to you. All right, so I just want to sort of get started by briefly touching on what my project is about, as well as explain how what I'm going to talk about today fits into the larger picture. One way to describe my project is as exploring the question of whether or not we have something like an epistemic obligation to be open-minded with respect to evidence, ideas, arguments, and the like that challenge our beliefs or maybe action-guiding commitments. And I'm particularly interested in the question as it pertains to politically or morally controversial or significant issues. So that's sort of the guiding question. Now, I'm inclined to think that if we have something like an epistemic obligation to engage open-mindedly, it's going to derive from something like a more basic epistemic obligation, which could be understood in a number of ways, but I'm just going to understand it as the obligation to make sure that one's beliefs are justified. We could talk about that, but that's just going to be sort of my working assumption. So assuming that that's right, I think that in order to get a handle on the obligation to be open-minded, I first need to get a handle on the more basic obligation from which it derives. And to start, I at least need to give an account of where that epistemic obligation might come from. The line I pursue is to say that the epistemic obligation to make sure one's beliefs are justified is grounded in non-epistemic obligations. So in this respect, my view is heavily inspired by William K. Clifford's account in the Ethics of Belief, as well as more recent work by Sandy Goldberg. So Clifford kind of famously said that we have epistemic obligations, they're grounded in moral obligations. Goldberg is, as I read him, is providing an important social analog to the Cliffordian argument. I think it's very interesting and important, but unfortunately I don't really have the time to discuss that here. So instead, what I'm going to do today is partially lay out my reasons for thinking that the sort of basic epistemic obligation is rooted in our moral obligations, since I think that case might be a little easier to motivate. And this can be seen as kind of a modern take on Clifford's argument in the Ethics of Belief. And then toward the end of the talk, I'll briefly give a sense of how I extend this account. So I think that one implication, though not the only implication, of taking this line of thought seriously is to see sort of the importance of meeting our epistemic obligations as proportional in some sense, to the importance of meeting the moral obligations which ground them. So in other words, the greater the moral harm that is at risk, that, say, one has a moral obligation to prevent, the more it matters that one, so to speak, gets things right epistemically. Okay, so here's a kind of quick and dirty retake of Clifford's argument, or the sort of moral cum epistemic obligation argument. So the first premise is that we have moral obligations. The second is that fulfillment of our moral obligations involves both not violating the corresponding rights of others and, within reason, minimizing the rights or the risk of violating the corresponding rights of others. 3, in order to fulfill our moral obligations, we have to make sure that beliefs relevant to these obligations are justified in order that we do not violate the corresponding rights of others or, within reason, minimize the risk of violating the corresponding rights of others. Thus, we have an epistemic obligation to make sure that beliefs relevant to the fulfillment of our moral obligations are justified. So for the purposes of this talk, I'm just going to take premise 1 for granted and try and sketch out some reasons for thinking that premises 2 and 3 hold. So in defense of premise 2, we can sort of begin by considering a particular example. So we might say that drivers have a moral obligation to not hit pedestrians or other drivers on the road, which might just be an instance of the more general obligation to not cause physical harm to others. Put in terms of rights, pedestrians and other drivers have corresponding rights to not be hit. Notice, however, that it's not enough that drivers do not actually hit anyone else. They must also, within reason, minimize the risk of hitting others. For example, by not texting while driving while intoxicated, etc. In terms of rights, others have a right to both not be hit and to expect that, within reason, drivers minimize the risk of hitting them. Put differently, others get to hold drivers accountable if they put them at significant risk of being hit. So it might be useful to clarify what's meant by having a right to expect here. So following Sandy Goldberg, I understand expectation in this context to be a normative expectation, i.e., quote, an attitude whereby we hold others responsible and where such expectations can be appropriate even when one has ample evidence that others will not meet them, unquote. So for instance, given certain norms that are in place, I can expect that my friend is ready when I go to pick her up. And importantly, I can have this legitimate expectation even if past experience tells me that she's going to be late. Because this expectation is grounded in standing norms rather than evidence I have regarding her behavior. So normative expectations can be contrasted in the sense with predictive expectations, which concern what one has a good reason to believe or expect, rather than a right to expect. Okay. So let's consider a different example to motivate premise 2. The moral obligations parents have to promote their children's physical health. So I think it's plausible to say that parents ought to actively promote the health of their children by making sure that they're getting enough sleep, food, vitamins, etc. They must also make sure that the health of their children isn't at risk of being compromised. So for instance, they have to vaccinate their children in order to prevent serious illness. Another way of putting this is that parents fail in their moral duties, both if they violate their children's right to good health and if they significantly risk the violation of their children's right to good health. So I don't have kids, but say I did. Even if my kids never, as a matter of fact, contracted a serious illness, preventable illness, this alone would not suffice for the fulfillment of my parental duties, because if I didn't vaccinate them, I allowed them to be at significant risk of contracting serious preventable illnesses. So I think the points illustrated in both of these examples can be generalized by saying that all else being equal, in order to fulfill our moral obligations, we must neither violate the rights of others nor act in such a way that we significantly risk violating the rights of others. Of course, risk comes in degrees. So for instance, although drivers must, within reason, minimize the risk of hitting pedestrians, they're not expected to eliminate the risk altogether, right? Because that would amount to going out on the road in general. So I want to be sensitive to this issue that there is a threshold of significance. But wherever that threshold lies is an interesting question, and we could debate it. However, the point I'm simply trying to establish here is that others can expectedly not significantly risk the violation of their rights wherever that threshold of significance lies. Okay, in defense of premise 3. So I think that the rationale for this premise falls quite naturally out of the rationale for the previous premise, because as other people in this area have pointed out as well, unjustified beliefs are just among the kinds of things that can result in the actual or significantly risk violation of others' moral rights. So to illustrate, a driver may fail to live up to her moral obligation to not hit pedestrians by texting, driving while drunk, etc. She might also fail to live up to her obligation by driving with unwarranted confidence regarding the risk that she poses to others. So consider this next example, which is kind of like an updated version of Clifford's ship owner example. So Danny has recently learned from reliable sources that certain parts used in her model of car are being recalled. For reasons not apparent to the mechanical engineers, a significant number of cars of this year and model have experienced sudden electrical failure, resulting in a number of serious accidents. Danny decides not to take her car into a dealership for testing. Instead, without any good reason, she believes that her car will not be among the unlucky lot and continues to drive it as she did before. I think that if it's correct to say that a driver fails to meet her moral obligation to others when texting or driving while intoxicated, then we should also say that she fails to meet her moral obligation when she drives with unwarranted confidence. This is so even if she does not end up causing harm to others, because she has significantly risked causing harm to others, and others have a right to expect that she not do this. Consider another example. Andy has read a couple of blog posts about the harms of vaccinations. Rather than looking into the matter and against his doctor's wishes, he decides to not vaccinate his children. He believes that vaccinating his children will likely cause him harm, and that not vaccinating them will not likely put them or others at risk of harm. I think it's correct to say that if Andy fails his children, for he has put them at significant risk of developing serious illnesses, and that at least part of his failure, or what gives rise to his failure, are his unjustified beliefs about the harms of vaccinations. As before, I think that these points can be generalized by saying that in order to fulfill our moral obligations, we have to make sure that beliefs relevant to those obligations are justified. For unjustified beliefs are simply among the things that can result in the actual or significant risk of others' rights. So whenever one's beliefs are relevant to the fulfillment of one's moral obligations, I think that we ought to make sure, or that person ought to make sure that those beliefs are justified. So as was the case with the term significant and significant risk, there are interesting discussions to be had about how to understand relevant here. That said, I'm just trying to establish that however we end up understanding relevant, it's plausible to say that we ought to make sure that our beliefs are justified when those beliefs are relevant to the fulfillment of our moral obligations. Okay, so that's kind of like a quick take on my Clifford-inspired argument. I don't have a lot of time to argue for this here, but I do want to highlight one important implication of taking this Cliffordian line of thought seriously. In particular, I think that it suggests that the importance of meeting our epistemic obligations is going to be proportional, in some sense, to the importance of meeting the moral obligations which ground them. In other words, the greater the moral harm that is at risk, the more it matters that, quote unquote, one gets things right epistemically. So that's kind of a hand-wavy way to put things, but that's sort of the general idea. So compare the following two cases. So Pablo promises his father that he will go to breakfast with him on Saturday. Pablo is a very forgetful person and knows this about himself. There's a significant chance that he already has plans Saturday, but he does not check his schedule, instead believing that it's open. As it turns out, he has already promised to go to breakfast with his best friend that day, so when Saturday comes, he'll have to break his promise to either his father or to his friend. And then the sort of reimagined case, which is pretty much the same, except rather than promising his friend or father that he will go to breakfast with them, Pablo promises his father that he will bring him to his chemotherapy appointment on Saturday morning, and to his best friend that he will watch her children as she attends a potentially career-changing meeting with a client. So it strikes me that Pablo commits a greater moral wrong in the reimagined case. Whereas in the first case, his promise breaking merely frustrates the breakfast plans of either his father or his friend. In the second case, Pablo will seriously fail either his father or friend, both of whom are depending on him to help them make appointments that matter a great deal to them. So again, insofar as it matters morally that we keep certain promises as compared to others, I think it also matters more epistemically that we get things right, and we make sure that beliefs relevant to the keeping of those promises are justified. We can consider another example. So my niece Stella has a mild nut allergy. When I babysit her, I have to be careful of what I feed her in order to make sure she doesn't get a mild allergic reaction. In particular, I have to avoid using dishes and silverware that might have come into contact with nuts. I also have to make sure that my beliefs about what contains or has been exposed to nuts are justified. For instance, I have to read labels on food packaging so that I don't feed her anything that might contain nuts, while having unwarranted confidence that she will not be harmed. So let's reimagine the case. Now, instead, Stella doesn't have a mild nut allergy, but rather a severe nut allergy. And if she's exposed to nuts, this can send her into anaphylactic shock. Whereas before I had to be careful, now I have to be extremely careful of what I feed her. So again, what I think that this suggests is that when there is a risk of greater moral harm, the more it matters that we quote unquote get things right epistemically. If we're inclined to say that I should be much more careful in general, in the case where Stella has a severe allergy, given that she is at risk of being much more seriously harmed, I think we should also say that it matters more, or I ought to be more careful epistemically, since being epistemically irresponsible is one of the ways in which I can allow harm to come to her, where this harm would be very grave. Okay, so that's a lot in a very short period of time, I understand. But this at least I should hope, would give you a sense of how I'm conceiving of epistemic obligations, including the ways in which I take them to be intimately related to our non-epistemic obligations. So in the short talk, I only had the chance to touch upon the relationship between the epistemic and moral. However, as I mentioned at the outset, I think there are promising ways of extending this sort of Concordian line of thought, as Goldberg does, to the social domain, which overlaps with the moral but is not coextensive with it. Right, that's it.
Okay, questions? Okay, we'll start with Rose, is it? Yeah.
Rose, would you mind speaking up so everybody can hear you too?
I know the previous talk you heard today by you, they talked about humility as an attitude, like you're humble towards like being good at sports, or you're not humble towards doing things like that. And I was wondering, so you considered it, when you consider humility a virtue, what's the difference, can you specify what you think the difference is between considering humility as an attitude and considering humility as a virtue?
I can say a little bit about that, but I would also be happy to hear from Sandra and Greg about that too.
Can you repeat the question for us?
I can repeat the question. So the question is, when I was just talking about humility, I was talking about it as a trait and a virtue, and how does that connect up with questions about humility as an attitude? So what's the difference between a trait and an attitude? So, so here's what I can say. I'm not an expert on attitudes, and there are experts on attitudes in the audience, so I will defer humbly to them about that. But what I can say about traits and virtues is this. So the way I've been thinking about this with Dennis, Jason, and Dan, we're sort of coming from an Aristotelian conception of virtues. So coming out of Aristotelian virtue ethics and Aristotelian virtue epistemology. So in Aristotelian virtue ethics and virtue epistemology, folks are thinking about virtues as dispositions. So Aristotle thinks that virtues are dispositions that are acquired character traits that are praiseworthy, right? So there's a lot built into that, but they're dispositions of action, affect, motivation, and perception that involve practical wisdom and all this stuff. Okay, so the four of us are coming from that tradition. So part of what that means is we're thinking about humility as a disposition to behave in particular ways, where we think owning can be manifested behaviorally, it can be manifested affectively, it involves caring about your limitations, and we think all owning is a disposition, right? So when we're humble, when we have the virtue of humility, we're disposed to appropriately own and be appropriately attentive to. Attitudes, as I understand them, don't build quite that much into the concept of an attitude. So I'm going to defer to other folks in the audience who know more about attitudes than I do. But from what I understand about attitudes, you can have a humble attitude or an arrogant attitude or a servile attitude that isn't relatively consistent. Right? So that's one way to think about it. You can have a humble attitude at one point in time and lack it at another point. Does that?
Yes.
And folks who want to chime in on that, please.
I think Walter, you.
Yes, I take it what Rose is getting at, if I understood, is in the case of, should you be humble in the face of white nationalists or Nazis or whatever, is maybe you want to say the person should still have the virtue of humility, but should not have the attitude of humility. Would that solve the puzzle?
Why wouldn't they have the attitude of humility in that instance?
Because they're talking to a Nazi. And that attitude, it's not good to have that attitude.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So what you're suggesting is they might have the virtue of humility dispositionally, but this would be an exception.
Exactly.
I see what you're saying.
I thought that's what you were saying.
Yes.
Okay. So, I mean, I think you could say that, but what we're trying to, so I think there are lots of reasons that people might think that's right. But what we're trying to argue is that even in these cases, right, it's still appropriate to be attentive to and own your limitations. And so I don't quite know how to map all the attitudes onto that, but I think what that commits me to saying, if we're in an easy mapping way, is, right, given the kinds of examples we're working with, if those examples work, then in those kinds of cases, we should be having the attitude. It's still appropriate to have the attitude. It's not enough to just have it dispositionally and to make exceptions.
Mark?
Yeah, thanks. So this is a question for Gus, I think. I was really intrigued by this sort of extended mind idea that people are they're Googling it, and they actually do end up understanding the topic better because they just did a little bit of internet research. And I was wondering if that's on the right track, the prediction would be that for the devices as well, if you tell them, go to YouTube and watch an explainer, and then type out an explanation to me how a zipper works, for instance, would you see the same effect where they actually increase rather than decrease in their confidence? Is that sort of how you expect this would work?
Yeah, so in the paper I mentioned, the 2017 Frank Kyle paper, they do a couple experiments kind of along those lines. And I'm not sure what to think of the effect in light of some of the stuff we have versus what's in the existing literature. But I think that what makes the most sense to me as a way to connect the illusion of explanatory depth literature with stuff about like complex social policies is that you have to sort of puncture the inflated sense of understanding. And it's not clear to me that going to watch a video or just having like a search result from Google actually does that. And so I think for the effect to hold, you need to do something to really force people to confront their ignorance. And it just strikes me that the standard way in the literature of just saying, generate 3 steps of an explanation doesn't seem sufficient, at least in the data we have, to do it.
No, sorry, but what I was trying to say is you should be able to reverse the original effects for like zippers and toilets and other mechanisms if someone goes and does the right kind of research. They'll actually be able to give you a decent enough explanation,
Right.
and then they should become more confident, and reasonably so.
Yeah, so in the Kyle paper, they do sort of manipulate, in one of the experiments, there's like 9 experiments in the paper, but they do sort of manipulate the quality of information, so they don't have people sort of go out onto the internet writ large, but they sort of create these web pages, and some of them actually provide the relevant information you need to like explain how some device works, and then some are sort of extraneous information. And I think they do find those with the cases where the participants show up at a web page that does have the relevant information.
Paul?
I was going to ask about virtues and traits, but we've already talked a little bit about that, so I'll talk with Heather.
Thank you. It's a long list, but that's David?
Yes, this is a question for Teresa and Heather. In both your analyses rest on the assumption that we can tell when we're in the right, when we're in the wrong. That is, we know when we're confident, we know when we actually don't necessarily know everything we do need to know. What if we relax that and actually produce a world in which we couldn't tell? Occasionally we can tell, but we usually can tell when we are in the right, truly, and we really can't tell when we're in the wrong or when we have a paucity of information or a paucity of expertise. That is, the situation that we're in is that the question actually is unknowable. How would that change your analysis?
First, okay.
I can go first if you want.
Yeah, so I guess this is something that I worry about myself. And I think part of what got me interested in the question is that we're often too comfortable with our beliefs and action guiding commitments. And I tend to think that we are not in good positions epistemically a lot of the time. And so getting to a place where we're more uncomfortable with how complex things are is kind of the direction I want to go in. I don't know if that gets to your worry at all, but I'm trying not to assume that we're easily able to tell when we've got things right, because I think that there are all sorts of reasons to think that we have things right when we don't.
Yeah, well, let me complicate things a little bit. Let's imagine we're not in the know. It usually turns out that we would want to get some advice. We want to get some outside information. And it turns out that if we're not in the know, often we don't know we're not in the know, so we don't turn to that information. We actually aren't very good judges at who to ask for that information. And we have a hard time recognizing whether the information is good or bad. So if we're in that sort of world, how might that change the analysis?
I mean, I guess I'm a little bit optimistic in the sense that I think that we can at least, when it comes to tough moral questions, tough political questions, even if we're not in a position to answer the question ourselves, I mean, this gets back to the earlier discussion, we can become better at determining who the experts are, upon whom we should rely. Yeah, I mean, that's sort of my optimistic hope, but yeah.
I'm going to give a less measured answer. So, at least with respect to the kinds of cases that that we were worried about in this paper, like white supremacism possibly being true, the Earth possibly being flat. I think we know the Earth is round, and we know that white supremacism is false.
I'm going to disagree. Those cases do exist. I'm going to disagree by saying no, we don't know when we're in them and when we're not in them.
We don't know when
We don't know when we're in those cases. So you're right, if we're in those cases, we should act that way. But the problem is, do we know
Oh, I
when
see
we're
what
in
you're
that case?
suggesting. Yeah, okay.
And
So-
that's, how does that change the analysis?
Right. So it can be, right, so, and that's why we're focusing on these cases in this paper.
But you don't know when you're in those cases.
Yeah.
That's my
So,
position,
right,
yeah.
so it depends on what analysis you have of knowledge,
Mhm.
right? So, I could get both long, boring, technical, okay, but I won't. So I guess, it is difficult for us to be able to figure out sometimes when we're in these cases and when we're not. I actually had a really interesting discussion with my seminar students this semester, earlier this semester, about how hard it is to know if you're an oppressed person in an interaction with an oppressor. And they seem to think that it wasn't that hard. Several of them are themselves marginalized along different axes of their identities. So I think there's some reason not to be skeptical about some of these cases. There are going to be harder cases. That's right. And then it becomes a separate question, how do we know when we're in those cases? And one answer to give is a virtue epistemology answer. Not the only answer on the scene by any means, but an answer that actually would require some kind of intellectually virtuous action in order to figure it out. And
Sorry, carry on, sorry. I thought you-
and what that means is, for people who don't already have intellectual virtues, it's going to be even harder to figure out.
So we have three follow-ups, so just super quick if possible. Michael and Paul and Michael all have a follow-up.
I think David's question is a great one. But I do think that, you know, in Teresa's case, it seems to me like correct me if I'm wrong, your question was, well, gee, if we, to put it really roughly, we have these obligations to, how are our obligations to engage in good science, for example, how are they grounded? And you're like, well, they're grounded in our other obligations, in morality. Science, you know, our obligations to have have our beliefs based on evidence are grounded on our other obligations to each other as human beings. Seems really plausible to me. Interesting question, though. I mean, in general, right? I mean, how we know when we should be acting on our obligations or what our obligations actually are. I mean, one of the things, and I think in a way, David's raising a super important question, but one that, as Heather just pointed out, is really hard and fundamental, right? How do we know when we're supposed to act on our obligations or what even our obligations to other people are, especially in complex moral situations? I take it the point that I take away from, and I have from, you know, that I think we all want to think about is the extent to which we could try to, at some other project, maybe not this one, try to figure out how to answer that question, you know? Because as Heather just said, or Teresa said, just about our moral obligations, I mean, both of you are more confident, it's interesting, we're often more confident about our moral stances than we are about our views about the empirical world. At least I am. I'm more confident about neo-Nazis being wrong. But the problem is it's more complicated. Those are the cases where we maybe should be, funnily enough, less confident. But I feel an obligation almost to be more confident in my moral obligations. Anyway, I just wanted to comment. I thought that was an interesting exchange. Thank you.
Quickly for Heather, especially given the response of your seminar, I wasn't sure why you lumped white supremacists in with flat earthers and talked about flat earthers as if they are oppressors.
Yeah, good. So
I don't feel oppressed by flat earthers.
Yeah, good. So we have, you can only, so there's a chunk of stuff in the paper where we try to define, the title of this paper is The Puzzle of Humility and Disparity. And so we try to define contexts of disparity. And we think that these are 3 different kinds of contexts of disparity. What's common, so flat earthers are not oppressors, and neo-Nazis sometimes are, but not, okay. Right, so we think there are 3 different kinds. And what's common to contexts of disparity is that there's going to be severe distance along a normative continuum, such that one person is in the right on that normative continuum and one person is in the wrong. So in the neo-Nazi case, the normative continuum is moral. The neo-Nazis in the wrong, we're in the right. In the flat earther case, the normative continuum is epistemic, right? So the flat earther doesn't have appropriate justification or epistemic credentials or what have you. We do. Barring the worries we had this morning about not knowing, why the earth is round, and so on, okay? And the normative dimension for oppressors and being oppressed is social power. So we think there's something that all 3 of these cases have in common that makes them contexts of disparity, but we think there are important differences between these cases. And one really important difference to point out is that oppression's systematic. And at least according to most definitions of oppression, it's systematic and structural, whereas we can have like a one-off interaction with a flat earther and never run into them again. Likewise with a white supremacist.
I'm not a follow-up, so
Oh,
there's
you
other
were.
people waiting, go ahead and
Great.
get them first.
Thank you. So Maxine.
Great. So this is for Heather. So I really like your list of things that are important about the virtue of humility, but there were some I was slightly less convinced of, and I wanted to focus on one under the heading 2. So when you talk about how humility can help us balance our beliefs, I think it's I'm sold on the fact that humility, because it gets us to attend to our limitations, can help us avoid unwarranted beliefs. But I thought it was slightly too strong to say that it helps us bolster our warranted beliefs. Just because it seems more accurate to say that it avoids undermining our warranted beliefs. What helps us bolster those beliefs is rather our pride, which gets us to attend to our strengths.
Good.
And I think that point sort of also generalizes to 3B and 5B. Basically, at every point where a lot of the values of humility, those values of humanity depended on the claim that it prevents us from being servile.
Mm-hmm.
But and that I think is what I wasn't quite sure was true, just because it seems like there's a difference between it not lapsing into servility and it preventing us from being servile.
Mm-hmm.
It's rather our attending to strengths that prevents us from being servile. And I think the case of I think the case of Douglas really bears this out. And when he talks about the anger that he ended up feeling, it's in the talking about his pride and his sense of his own dignity.
Yeah, terrific. So I think that's an excellent comment. When we first started thinking about humility and pride, we distinguished them such that pride applies to strengths in the way that Maxime is suggesting, and humility applies to limitations. And so what Maxime is suggesting is that maybe at least part of what's doing the work here is, or maybe what's primarily doing the work here is pride and not humility. I mean, so I guess here's what I have to say in response to that, insofar as I have a response. So I think a lot of this has to do with what owning is going to entail in these contexts. And I agree, and I think all the authors on this paper agree, that owning may not, it doesn't like magically get us to change our beliefs. But owning might if I recognize that I'm so focused on my own limitations that I'm not, that I don't think that I have anything to contribute with respect to the neo-Nazi or showing that they're wrong or showing that the flat earther's wrong or something like that, then I think that what owning can do is it can help us recognize that we're being servile there and try to walk it back. So it's not as if it's going to magically produce these things that I'm suggesting. Like, especially with respect to emotion, like we can't just change our patterns of emotion. That takes training, right? If I do have white hot anger with respect to the flat earthers and I have that dispositionally in some way, then I'm not just going to be able to shut it off through owning. Like, that's going to take time for me to retrain myself. I think that the short answer to this is, I think whether or not humility, the degree to which humility is going to help us get some of these things is going to depend on owning and how much owning gets us. Yeah, does that help?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
Okay, so we have just under 10 minutes and there's 8 people on the list. So I'm going to encourage dynamic, rapid fire exchange and see if we can get as many voices heard as possible. And remembering that there is caffeine like around the corner, presumably, right?
Caffeine and wine.
Good,
Ooh,
right,
fancy.
So rapid fire exchange starting with Rob.
Thank you. This is a question for Teresa Allen. Just about the how you're understanding the two main Bianca categories here. So part of the talk is about moral rights of others, and then the upshot has to do with moral harm. It seems to me that there's some case, often it's the case that the stringency of our moral rights is tracking something about proportional harms, but there are all kinds of cases in which one commits a pretty serious violation of my moral rights without harming me at all.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yep, that was very
No, that's a good point. I have to think about how more here.
So why attach it to a weighting of the moral harm rather than a weighting of just the stringency of the right? Why bring the moral harm?
So I think part of my struggle was I was trying to figure out how to capture the fact that there is this proportional significance. And I started putting it in terms of obligations and rights. And then I started thinking about how hard it is to individuate obligations and rights. And so I backed off and put it in terms of harm. But now you're making me think that I shouldn't do that. So yeah, I need to think about how to better articulate it. But yeah, my take on it.
Totally sufficient.
Okay. Drew?
Hi, great. So I think this is a question for Gus, although I didn't even think about it. So I find it fascinating how you're talking about asking these sorts of how questions doesn't necessarily drive down confidence. And so what I wanted to do is maybe distinguish between two things that might be going on here. So I'm wondering whether in response to a how question that one doesn't really know how to answer, does that mean, is there an underlying assumption that that means it's appropriate to lower confidence? Or is there instead maybe an overestimation of one's understanding of why it is that one should be confident? Maybe to clarify, so I'm thinking here of think in contrast to how questions concerning basic self-knowledge. So if I ask, how do you know that you're in pain? It doesn't seem appropriate to give a kind of explanation for that. Yet we don't think that that should detract from the confidence of your self-belief.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, maybe one thing to say first, and then you can tell me if you still have the question after this, is that I think one of the reasons that we thought it was interesting to think about how questions was in contrast to why questions, right? Where why questions usually involve the enumeration of reasons or evidence, or they're kind of in the argumentative realm. how questions sort of put you more in a kind of explanatory realm. And so I don't know, I mean, maybe you all feel differently, but it sort of always struck me that it was that contrast with arguments that was sort of doing the most work and made the question interesting in that way.
I would only add that the question, how do you know this, is ambiguous between what reason do you have to believe it and what process or mechanism led you to form the belief. And so that might be one reason you get somewhat different intuitions about that question.
Greg?
So apologies for Teresa, I might have misunderstood that. I was trying to figure out the moral obligations to others and just how others are generally thought about in the context of debate and discussion. Wondering, in others, in your view, is this the general population, or could we have implicit others that we are trying to protect in the context of our judgments, as opposed to others with whom we are in dialogue? I just wondering if you could say more about who the others are.
Yeah. So I should also note that I think that we have moral obligations to ourselves too. So I don't know if I might have put too much emphasis on the others. I think the basic point that I'm trying to get at is whatever our moral obligations are, in order to meet them, it's also going to matter that we have justified beliefs with respect to meeting them. So this doesn't always come up in conversation. I mean, or in particular instances. I mean, it could be sort of more general than that. I mean, some of the cases that I'm interested in are political issues that have moral impact, where the others could be, people writ large, or particularly large population of people. And so I'm trying to think of it pretty neutrally. I don't know if that gets at your...
I think so. I guess it's just because I think of the partisanship that tends to happen in these discussions, and how it feels as though people are protecting different others, in more considerations at times, and then trying to get them to agree on the same group. Just psychologically, it seems like there's something at play there, but I don't know how that translates philosophically.
Yeah, so I guess I'm thinking this as like larger than the sort of political sphere. So not necessarily when it comes to talking about politically contentious issues, but I'm interested in the question because of the implications it has for so.
Alessandra?
My question too is what there is. So maybe I misunderstood, so this is a question for clarification. So if I read your conclusion, it talks about an epistemic obligation vis-a-vis certain beliefs that are relevant to moral obligation. Well, there are beliefs that are not like that, right?
Yep.
So, so presumably you also think that we have an epistemic obligation to hold them responsibly, right?
That are not relevant to moral beliefs?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That is a bit odd, right? That you have the same epistemic obligation, but the grounding of that obligation depends on whether that belief happens to have this moral implication or happens not to.
So yeah, so this is just a very small part of the larger picture. So I think that, I didn't really get to talk about it, but what Goldberg is doing kind of fills this picture out. So I think that there are going to be cases where we can hold people epistemically responsible, not because they've failed some kind of moral obligation, but because there's some kind of social obligation that they've failed to live up to. Yeah, and then I also think that, because there are going to be beliefs that are not relevant to either our moral or our social obligations, but I think that there is a story to be told about how even those beliefs we can hold people accountable for, how they form them. We can talk after, yeah.
Yeah, so thanks everybody, it was great. This is actually a question for Heather, just kind of as an outsider, and I'm sort of fascinated by the notion of limited virtues. And so I'm wondering, are there unlimited virtues? And again, this is outside my field, but I mean, it seems to me that you have, you have a puzzle, and the way out of the puzzle is to say that the virtue is limited, and then you sort of address the sort of reality or the sort of the real world aspects of the puzzle by sort of delineating what that particular virtue is. So, so my question then is, I mean, it seems to me, well, let's say the question, does anybody hold that it is to be kind of unvirtuous, you know? I mean, what's the counter argument to this? Like, and does that mean that there is a position that that rests upon the notion of this particular virtue is unlimited, or you know, or all virtues are unlimited? Does this make sense?
So what we tried to do in this paper was say, set the puzzle up in such a way. There are lots of folks who think, I think for good reasons, that of all the possible virtues we might list, like justice, courage, perseverance, pride, humility, gratitude, benevolence, maybe some other virtues, right, are gonna start looking problematic when we think about whether they apply in interactions with oppressors, neo-Nazis, flat earthers, and so forth, okay? And then what we tried to do is say, okay, here's how you might interpret humility in ways that make that claim true, right? So if we're thinking about humility as a trait, not a virtue, then Frederick Douglass is right, because you can have too much of the trait. You can have it, you can go overboard, you can be servile, right? And he's right. But if you think about humility as a virtue, in the way we've been trying to defend, then we want to say it's still applicable. Yeah, does that?
So I'm told we're sticking strictly to time, so apologies to the 3 people still on the list, but let's thank us.